But now that you're talking about it, though, it all starts to make sense. But you do have to take into consideration this idea, like you said, that this is layers of multiple stories and timelines intertwining together. And I think a lot of historians just skip over and they'll, pick a side on it. Whereas when you really dissect it and try to unfold it, now it becomes complicated. And the regular person doesn't want a complicated story. They want something simple that they can digest easily and they can be done with it, which is why it's worked for so long. When the truth, actually, you have to be like a detective in your approach, and you really have to dissect it and try to pick it apart in order to get all these different elements. So confuse us away, Ralph, because I think it's valuable.
Yeah, well, you've just got to understand what these people were trying to do. So the first chronological chasm was a defense against having Jesus connected with the Jewish revolt. So they took Jesus away from that event by giving us the 40-year chronological chasm. The second Arthurian chasm, was caused by the same problem. They had this history, which was brought back, as we said at the very beginning, from Syria by the Crusaders and the Templars. And it was heretical. Everything we've been discussing is being pretty heretical. How can you tell that story within the 12th century? You can't. You'll be roasted alive. You would be a heretic. So you've got to do something to that story in order to cover it up, in order to hide it. How can you do that? Well, what they decided to do was to link this story with British history, because Jesus ended up in Britain anyway, and we'll come on to that later. He ended up in Chester. What they wanted was a similar story that they could link this history into. And what Jesus was doing in Judea was he was a king. He was a king of Edessa. He had a tax dispute with Rome, and he was going to try and invade Rome to become the new emperor. That was the key thing that I identified in my last book, Jesus, King of Edessa, was that this was not a local Judean story. Jesus wanted to become the emperor of Rome. That was the whole idea of taking over Judea as the king of Judea, the king of the Jews, in order so that he could then leapfrog into Rome and become the emperor of Rome. And the person he fought was Commander Vespasian. Commander Vespasian won that war, and he became the next emperor. So this was a battle between two emperors, or two contenders for the emperorship. So this was the story they were trying to write, of a king having a tax dispute with Rome and wanting to take over Rome. So what they wanted was a similar story that they could attach this history onto. And it so happens that in Britain there were two possibilities where they could attach this history onto. One was the history of Magnus Maximus, who was a British king who led a revolt against Rome and became the emperor of Rome temporarily, a usurper emperor. And the other was Constantine III. And Constantine III was a king from Brittany who became the king of Britain, who again led a tax dispute against Rome and became the emperor of Rome temporarily. So here was two contenders who had similar lives to the biblical Jesus, and they could attach this story onto these kings. And then you could write this story and say, oh, it all happened in Britain, of course, in the Dark Ages. Well, not quite the Dark Ages, because Magnus Maximus was 4th century, and Constantine III was the beginning of the 5th century. So it's not quite the right era, but it's almost the right era. So we can write this story and pretend it's about Britain, and nobody is going to get strung up and killed for it. And so they invented this second chronological crevasse, which is the Arthurian crevasse, which is a 500-year crevasse. And so within Arthurian history, you have this crevasse, because all of the history we've been talking about is about Joseph of Arimathea, which is 1st century. And then you have to try and navigate your way through 500 years to end up with a story about 5th or 6th century Britain. And most of the manuscripts, I have to say, do it very badly. So if you take Eschenbach, for instance, Parsifal, he starts in Babylon and ends up in France. And he never quite overcomes this chronological crevasse, because he ends up with most of his accounts in France being sort of 1st century, really. He never really makes it into the 5th century or 6th century. And so we end up with these two Galahads. One is the son of Joseph of Arimathea, and the other one is the son of Lancelot. And they both become king. And one of them becomes the king of Sarras, and the other becomes the king of Wales. But this is where we have to look again at the original text, like we did with Pendragon that wasn't Pendragon. We have to look at the original text again, because what the translators are doing is the translators know the story. And so they say it's Wales, but they don't know the story. So they've led us astray by saying he was the king of Wales, when that's not what the text says. The text says he was the king of Galles, not Wales, and they've translated Galles as being Wales. He didn't become the king of Wales. He became the king of Galles, and the Galles were the Galli priests of Syria. And so now we come into the story of the Galles, and this is a very interesting aspect of both biblical history and also of Arthurian history, because the Galles were the eunuch priests of Cybele. And surprisingly enough, they are a central component within biblical history, because Jesus asked for his disciples to become eunuchs, to get castrated. And you probably didn't hear about this in Sunday school lessons.
No.
because they're not going to talk about it. But anyway, it's perhaps worth me quoting this one, because people don't tend to believe it. Anyway, Jesus says to his disciples, there are some eunuchs that are born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men. And there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. Matthew 19:11. What Jesus is asking here is any of his disciples who can receive castration to be castrated and become eunuchs. Why? Because the eunuchs were the Galli high priests of Cybele. And this is what he was asking his disciples to come from, to do. And this is why Jesus himself is called a Galilean. And also St. Peter is as well. Yeah, St. Peter is called a Galilean in Luke 23:26. The Galileans were not from Galilee, which is what they want you to think. The Galileans were the Galli high priests. They were the eunuchs. And this is why Jesus was asking his disciples to become eunuchs, because they were the Galileans.
And that would be because the consort of Cybele was it Attis and then Mithras? I mean, there's a whole Mithras tie-in there, isn't there?
Yep, absolutely. Because of Attis. Attis was the eunuch son, partner of Cybele. And so they were, as the high priests, they were following in the footsteps of Attis. And this is what it was talking about in Arthurian history when we have a person called Galahad who becomes the king of the Galles. It wasn't talking about Wales. It was talking about him becoming the king of the Galli, the eunuchs. So he was becoming the high priest of the Galli eunuchs. that is what Sir Galahad was being asked. And we know this for many reasons. We know this because Sir Percival, and Percival is Galahad. There are many reasons for thinking they are the same person. Percival does this himself. Percival takes his sword and he thrusts it between his thighs to become a eunuch. And one of the central titles within Arthurian history is the Wounded King. And the Wounded King is wounded between the thighs. He is a eunuch. He is a galley high priest. So Sir Galahad was a title. So his name was Percival, but his title was Galahad, which means the king of the galley, the chief galley, Galahad. So Percival was a galley high priest, exactly the same as the disciples of Jesus were galley high priests. So Sir Galahad was actually a eunuch, and he didn't wear red armor, he wore a red dress, which might sound bizarre in terms of Arthurian history, but stay with me on this one for a minute, because the galley, when they we have some quotes here from Lucian about the galley, how they became galleys, and it says here of the galley festival. On these days, the galley are made. These are the eunuchs, of course. While the rest are playing flutes and performing rites, frenzy comes upon many, and he throws off his clothes and he rushes into the center with a great shout and takes up his sword and immediately castrates himself. And then the galley rushes through the city holding his testicles, and he takes women's clothes and adornments from whichever house he throws the testicles into.
I'm sorry, it's just like, wow, like this stuff was never brought forward in any King Arthur story I've ever heard, so this is incredible. But it's just interesting that
it's new, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, what an interesting like tie-in also, Michael, with some of the work that you just did recently on the event that we did regarding the female Illuminati, and just getting into that, the symbolism behind some of these rituals coming out of the ancient world. I don't know if you ever want to go into any of that stuff, but it's the whole castration thing is just, and women's clothing. I mean, that's now in the church today with the priest class, adorning themselves. Everything is about the women's clothing and whatnot, right?
Well, I mean, I hope they never bring these traditions back. I don't want some guy throwing his ghoulies in my hall.
Oh shit!
But yeah, we went into this whole castrate thing, Cybele cult. Remember the Cybele cult and the Galli and the female Illuminati? You're quite right. I'd totally forgotten. But yeah, there's a lot of tie-in with this as well, because these are old ancient traditions that these royal families, they're not only keeping the astro-theological myths alive, and then when they have a son, like in the case of Isis, he's going to be a stereotypical person, but to the public, and also from a ritualistic point of view, he's going to be identified with the sun, or Venus, or Sirius, or Orion. There's all of this stellar tie-in, as Ralph is saying, because of these processional movements, but just the very fact that that's their tradition, that's what they do behind their walls. We find out about it later. The public are involved in that ritual, but it's an esoteric ritual, and therefore, everything from the building of their castles. Ralph found a huge zodiac in Chester. I misspoke before and said Cheshire at the opening of our interview, but in Chester, where the internment had happened, isn't that true that you'd found a zodiac there as well, Ralph?
That's right, and I've further refined that as well, because I've further refined exactly what that zodiac actually represents, and it's very clever, actually. It doesn't just represent a zodiac, it represents the conjunction between the celestial sphere and the ecliptic, and that's where we get the Vesica Piscis from. It's not simply a symbol of Pisces, as many people say, and in fact, as I said before as well. It's actually a picture of the two circles of the ecliptic, and the celestial sphere. And where they join, they form this sort of vesica piscis, this sort of almond shape, this fish shape.
Like the kind of mandorla that you see in Christianity?
Yeah, exactly the same. That's where it came from. And that's the shape of this particular temple in Chester, this temple that was actually built by Jesus when he was exiled there after the Jewish revolt. It's the same imagery, and it's also the same imagery on the Zodiac of Dendera, and we might come on to this later if we have time. The Zodiac of Dendera, which is a first century Egyptian, Greco-Egyptian zodiac, has the same design. So yes, this was a central component of their theology and their history, was all to do with this processional zodiac. And these eunuchs were part of it because there is another good zodiac on the Sea of Galilee as well, which is the Hamat-Taveria zodiac. And that's a very interesting zodiac because that is processional, it's first century, and it shows the central character, who is the Arthurian character. So we have the central character within a zodiac can either be the sun, Helios, or Ursa Major. And Ursa Major is, of course, the Great Bear. And this is where the name of Arthur came from. This is why Arthur is the central character. This is why Arthur is surrounded by 12 knights of the Round Table, because the Round Table was a zodiac. It's not a table at all, it's a zodiac. Well, it might have been a real table. They might have all sat round it, a little bit like the Round Table in Winchester. But it would have...
Just to throw in one small point, and again, I may be wrong etymologically, but the word Camelot, the C-A-M aspect, can be like a camshaft, something that revolves. So the very word Camelot has within it, even loosely, the idea of a rotating, something that rotates. And if you get into the etymology of a lot of the Arthurian stuff, like Tintagel and all of these places, there's a lot of this rotating symbolism actually comes up. Can't get into it now, but Camelot is a word that almost has the camshaft, the idea of a rotating, which is very central to Celtic mythology, referring, as you say, to the heavens.
Absolutely, and Emperor Nero had exactly the same. He had a rotating dining room, which was drawn with the symbols of the heavens on it. So he had a rotating dining room, no less, not just a table. So, yeah, the Arthurian character is the Ursa Major figure. That's what King Arthur means. King Arthur means the Great Arthur or the Great Bear. The Great Bear is Ursa Major. It's the same name. That's why he had 12 disciples, 12 knights around his round table. That's why Jesus had 12 disciples around his table, because Arthur was Jesus. So Jesus had a round Last Supper table surrounded by 12 disciples or knights. It's the same symbolism. And it was all based upon the zodiac. And
it's interesting, too. I just kind of thought of this. There was a mention, I'm trying to remember exactly how it was stated in the New Testament by Jesus, talking about, I'm here to bring the sword. And
yes.
And so a lot of people thought, it meant the sword of truth and all of that. But then that also ties into the idea of Excalibur and what King Arthur was. That whole legend of King Arthur, when you really compare the two, it sounds quite similar in a way.
Oh, it is. And it's also a reference to the Jewish revolt, of course, because he was a warrior monarch. He was a warrior king. And so when Jesus says, I did not come to bring peace to the world, I came to bring a sword.
Right, yeah.
And then he goes on to the little apocalypse, as they say it, where he says he's going to bring civil war basically to Judea. It's part and parcel of this Jewish revolt idea, where he was actually a warrior monarch, not a pauper prince of peace. And the best one, I do have a quote here somewhere, is I think it's Luke 19:27, where he says, bring my enemies before me who would not acknowledge me as their king, and kill them in front of me. Luke 19:27.
Sounds like a Prince of Peace to me.
Yeah, precisely. It's not the sort of thing you'll get from the pulpit.
Right.
But this is part and parcel of what the actual story was about. He was a warrior monarch. He was making a bid for the throne of Rome, as well as the king of Judea. This is what Arthur was doing as well, because remember, this is the big problem with Arthurian history. Why he cannot exist in the Dark Ages was because the central theme within Arthurian history is that King Arthur wanted to become the Emperor of Rome. So he has a tax dispute with Rome, and he wants to become the King of Rome, the Emperor. Now, this could not have happened within the Dark Ages when they set this story, because they set this story in the late 5th century, early 6th century. Quite often it's about 530 or so AD. There was no Rome in 530. It had ended. It had gone. It has disappeared. It was an ex-Rome. It had fallen off its perch. Rome ended in 480 AD. So all of these Arthurian histories that say Arthur had a tax dispute with Rome, and that's one of the central elements of all of these Arthurian manuscripts, cannot be correct, because there was no Rome to have a dispute with. It did not exist. So how can we explain this story? Well, because it was actually a 1st century story. We have this great chronological chasm, a 500-year chasm. And these events actually happened in the 1st century. And they were called Galileans. This is why, as we were saying before, that Galahad received this title, because he was a Galilean. And he wore a dress, just as you were saying. Yeah, it was you who were saying that the priesthood have the same traditions now. And I'm sure you'll bring up an image of this. I'll send you some images later.
Absolutely. And same kind of rituals as well, with the whole abstinence and this sort of hatred for the sexual parts of the whole aspect of that. It's all just a reflection of these ancient cults, right? Yes.
Instead of being eunuchs, they try to be chaste, of course, and that's why Catholic priests are not allowed to marry, and that's why Catholic priests wear a dress, a red dress, and I'll send you some pictures later, obviously. But if you just imagine a cardinal on his procession through the cathedral, you will know exactly the sort of thing that Sir Galahad would have been wearing. He would have been wearing exactly the same uniform, and it happens to be a red dress. And you might be thinking, hold on, Sir Galahad was a brave knight in shining armor with his magical sword, who was cutting his enemies down left, right, and center. How does this equate with this effeminate new Galahad that is coming out of this new research? That he was a eunuch priest of Cybele. It dovetails exactly, and we have this history again courtesy of Josephus Flavius. And Josephus Flavius gives us a complete description of these Galli high priests. And he calls them Galileans. He doesn't call them Galli, he calls them Galileans, which of course is the title for Jesus and St. Peter, who were both called Galileans. Anyway, I shall quote again, because this is quite an interesting little quote. This is Josephus Flavius talking about the Galileans in the 1st century, and these were the people who were involved in the Jewish revolt. In fact, they were central key players within the Jewish revolt. And he says, the Galileans indulged themselves in feminine wantonness. They decked their hair and put on women's garments, and were smeared with ointments that they might appear very comely. And they had paint on their eyes, and imitated not only the ornaments, but also the lusts of women. But while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands. And while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors, and drew their swords from under their finely dyed cloaks and ran people through with their swords. So, the eunuch Galahad was also a warrior. He might have been dressed in a woman's red dress. He might have worn makeup and lipstick and eyeshadow and wiggled his hips like a wanton woman, as Josephus says. But he also had a sword under his cloak, and he took out his sword and he killed his enemies. So, yes, Galahad was still a knight. Not necessarily in shining armor. He was a knight in a red dress, but he was still a knight of the realm. And this might be a bit shocking for Arthurian history, but what I'm doing here is just following the evidence without fear or favor, just following the evidence wherever it takes. And the evidence takes us back into first century Judea, where this was the reality of the Jewish revolt. But this ended up as a British story. So how did we get to Britain? Well, we've already spoken about one reason why it ended up in Britain. But there is another reason it ended up in Britain, and that's because the Jewish revolt failed. And it was Rome that won this particular revolt. And so the leaders of the revolt were crucified, taken down from the cross, and one of them survived, and all of them were taken as captives to Rome. But what was Rome going to do with these particular captives? I mean, these were dangerous rebels from the east of the empire who had started a Jewish revolt against Rome. What Rome wanted was to quell all of these ideas of revolt in the Eastern Empire. So what Rome wanted to do was to stop this militancy from militant Judaism, which is why they sent Joseph of Arimathea to Sarras to take the surrender and to change their religion. But the survivors of the Jewish revolt were taken into captivity, and they were eventually taken to Britain, to Chester, where Rome went and built what you might call a sort of first century Guantanamo Bay, basically. And that was Fortress Diwa, which was in modern Chester. And that was a prison fortress, and that is where they ended up. So this story does move naturally from Judea to first century Britain, because that was as far as you could get from Judea within the first century, within the Roman Empire. If you look at the opposite end of the empire from Judea, the opposite end ends up in Britain. And the frontier of Britain at that particular time, we're talking AD 70 here, was Chester in Britain. And that's where they built this fortress. Is also was built. This was in Fortress Diwa, where we find this Temple of the Zodiac, I suppose you could call it, was built in this particular fortress, which was very unusual, of course. You didn't normally build temples within a fortress. And here in Chester, we end up with this Temple of the Zodiac.
And isn't it interesting that in one of the renditions of the Arthurian story, Percival, first, he's a huntress. He has a single mother, right? So if you're dealing with the Cybele concept, it's they're living in the middle of the forest. He's basically dressed like some John the Baptist hunter character in skin.
Yes.
And he has the famous mother, of all the fairy mythologies, no father to be seen. And then he says that he sees the castle in the forest in which the knights go to and fro, and then in seeing them in their gleaming armor, I think he sees Sir Galahad or he sees Lancelot, and then he decides to become a knight. So this all fits when you strip away the fairy folklore stuff around it. It's exactly corresponds to what you're talking about when you know how you have the keys of decipherment.
Yeah, absolutely. These were all real events, but of course, as you're saying, that they took on the roles of particular characters and particular gods and particular goddesses. So they were acting out some of these events from mythical history, from religious history, and taking on the roles of these particular characters. So yeah, that fits in very well with the story. And I suppose in a way we should talk a bit about the Holy Grail, really, shouldn't we?
Oh yeah, let's get into that. That's some juicy bits.
I'll just pre-accuse that by saying that the Sibyl, in my work, from my interest years ago in Arthurian stuff, then I found out, one of Sibel's main symbols was a circle, just a circlet, which is the Zodiac, obviously. She's Taurus, she's one of the primordial goddesses, but the circlet can also transmogrify into the cup or the chalice. We see this in Celtic mythology, where you have the cauldron of all life, or even a cauldron that sort of, can even restore dead heroes to life. But there is a Sibyl tie-in, or at least, let's say, Sibyl is identified with the Middle East, then it would be with some of her Western antitypes or prototypes. So it'd be interesting to see, because in my reading of it, the Grail would precede all the biography that Ralph is talking about. It's a primordial goddess symbol. So it'll be really interesting for people who've come at the Grail that way and seeing its deep antiquity. It is found in the tarot suits. It is found in ancient mythologies of Ireland and other places. It'd be really interesting now to see how Ralph, brings it together with the stereotypical story that he's talking about.
Yeah, it is. It's a very ancient story. And as you say, it precedes Arthurian history. It precedes biblical history. It precedes everything. And yes, it is pan-European, because it's a history that's sort of popped up in various locations. As you say, it appears in Celtic history. The Celtic Cross is essentially a zodiac. You have this circle with the cross in the middle. It's the cross of the zodiac, and it's all sort of interlinked and interwoven through the whole history of Europe. And I'm not entirely sure if this is just the way it has spread through Europe, that it's arrived in all parts of Europe, or whether it was a part and parcel dotted within Europe from ancient history times. I don't know. It's, in a way, I'm only scratching the surface, because this is such a deep subject. If you want to look at it from a Celtic perspective or from a Germanic perspective, you will find all sorts of ways of looking at this new history from the perspective of each particular region and each particular culture. So I think, in a way, I've scratched the surface of this problem in 600 pages, no less. But I think a lot of people can follow in this footsteps, especially someone like yourself, Michael, who understands these histories from a slightly different perspective, and you'll be able to build upon it and find out so much more information now that the basic structure has been made.
Well, so, I think that your work has always undergirded my work. My ideas through once I started back in the early 80s and building slowly, I had nothing but questions, because you read and read and read, you have nothing but questions. Your work is more like the glue that helped me, or the cement that helped me put the bricks in the right place. The picture on the box that helped my pieces all to come together. And as I said in the beginning, even though we may look at the foreground now and see the biographical details, it still doesn't mean that the backdrop of mythicism, the mythos, disappears. That's ridiculous. In order to have the entire perspective of foreground, middle ground, and in the foreground, all of it comes together to work as a synthesis, and you've been doing that. You, like myself in a way, take up a single piece of information and have through the years looked at it in multiple different perspectives, which is extremely rare today. People get dogmatic. They see a particular scenario and then they run at it, and then it's just this or it's just that. There's not this kaleidoscopic, synthetic mode of looking at things. So for me, the Grail can be Sibyl. The Grail can be, the romances of Ireland. It can be the from Breton and Brittany. Every tradition has this. It can be a metaphor for the goddess tradition and the wisdom. It can be the secret society emblem of the blood in the Grail, not the Grail itself, but the severed head. going back to ancient skull cults, which were goddess cults. It can be the symbol of the the transference of power, right? That in the female Illuminati, we said that the female holds because remember, the Grail can also be a plate, not just a cup, but isn't that true? It can be a pentacle or a plate upon which the severed head sits, like you do see in the biblical story of John the Baptist. And then that can be a symbol of the transference of power from a different secret society head, one to the other. And who is the female who's always connected from the earliest times, from the earliest French legends, or Chrétien de Troyes, or like you said, what was his name? Eichenbach, Wolfram von Eichenbach, and the other, Baudin. All of these people are talking about it being the female turns up with the Grail. So it can go as deeply into Celtic legend. I even see it as you were talking about the bear, you see art, the movement of the bear going around the pole star. This is Arthur, right? But that then takes us right back into the Arctic homeland before the pole shift, when the 12 signs were equidistant around the celestial sphere. We're dealing with stuff that has multiple interpretations here. And then the Arctic homeland would be the inverted Grail, or the sun and the moon were like grails. There's like cups, like bowls in the sky, So I mean, there's no reason to be didactic, or declarative. These are wonderful things to investigate from multiple perspectives, so that then, like you're doing, you tease out the facts. But what we've had is the background, and we've had the middle ground, right? The way I look at it artistically is that you're putting in the foreground. You're actually giving us a close-up now of who these characters are, so we can see their actual features. We can determine, more about their actual detail, and this is helpful then. But the background doesn't disappear. We still need to know the history of the church, the history of these, the cardinals and the priests, and all of that we know. It's in our vision. But in order to have this template, it's vital to really understand where all of this stuff comes from, so that we can have insight into that esoteric knowledge.
Yes, you need the background in order to see the foreground, because the foreground comes from the background. You have to understand how all these things were written, because it was heretical. You could not write about it. So people wrote about these events and these artifacts tangentially, because you could not address the situation honestly. So you had to create a mythology around it, a different way of explaining it, in order that you could talk about it without being persecuted by the Catholic Church or whatever other church it was. And so all of these different mythologies formed their own way of explaining the same subject. And so within Arthurian legend, the Grail itself has 3 or 4 facets within this multifaceted idea of the Grail. The best description of the Holy Grail comes from Wolfram von Eschenbach, as you've just been as you've been saying in his Parsifal. And how best to explain this? Well, let's go directly at it. So the Grail is a stone. So the very essence of the Holy Grail is a sacred stone. And this is not an Arthurian stone, of course. This comes, as you say, from prehistory. This is the Benben Stone of Egypt. And the Benben Stone of Egypt was always identified with the phoenix. And interestingly enough, Eschenbach says that the Grail stone, because he describes it as a stone, was brought to Earth by aliens. And that's how he describes them. He's not even describing them as being angels as such. He's describing them as being aliens. And the aliens gave this stone. It's a conical stone. It's not very big. You could probably imagine it being about 80 centimeters high. What's that? 2.5 foot high. Conical in nature, maybe about 2 foot across at the base. And there may have been more than one of these. There may have been 2 stones, not 1 stone. Anyway, this stone was brought to Earth, and it was given to a special family to look after, a royal family. And so within Arthurian history, you have these many allusions to a grail, which are diversionary. They are hidden meanings for the grail, because no one could really talk about this grail stone directly. So the common one we get, of course, is the grail, a dish. But that was born out of the Sangreal wordplay, which is a very old wordplay. You know, some people say, oh, this was only born in that very famous book, what was it, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, by Bagent and Lee, where they highlight this wordplay. But this wordplay actually goes back into medieval history. So it's a very old wordplay between the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which is a holy dish, and the blood royal, the sang royal, being a very simple wordplay in the French. So the dish is a bloodline. And when you go through Arthurian history, especially through the Vulgate cycle, the Grail is always identified with a princess. And so all the way along, it's trying to allude to the Grail being a princess. So every time the knights see the Grail, all they see is a princess holding a dish. And nobody can quite understand what this Grail is. What is this dish? What is so special about the dish? And of course, the Grail is not the dish at all. The Grail is the person holding the dish. So the Grail is the princess. And that's why the knights cannot see the Grail, because they're looking at the wrong thing. As I describe in my book, it's like children looking for Father Christmas when their parents are standing in front of them. And they still can't see Father Christmas. And so this is...
So then it's the womb figure. The child can't see the womb in which it's born.
Absolutely. So this is the illusion they are made to. So that these are the 2 or 3 aspects of the Grail. The Grail was a sacred stone, but the Grail was given to a bloodline to look after, and the bloodline is the Grail princess. So the Grail has a princess who looks after it, tends to its needs. But the princess can't guard a Grail. And so the Grail must also have a Grail knight to look after it. And the Grail knight is the Galahad, the head galley, the galley high priest. And the knight who looks after the Grail must be a eunuch, which is why the Grail keeper is always described within the Vulgate cycle as being the wounded king, who is also the Fisher King. Why is he the wounded king? Because he's been castrated. So he is the eunuch. He is the Galahad. And so these are the 3-4 aspects of the Grail. And
well, this would also then make it equivalent, would it not then, in Celtic legend, to the Stone of Fal, or the coronation stone on which the kings are coronated?
Absolutely. So how do we get from the Near East over to Ireland and maybe to Scotland? The history of this stone is complex, and I think there is 2 stones which complicates it. This was the stone that came from Egypt. So this is the Benben Stone. It was originally at Heliopolis. And of course, Joseph was the high priest of Heliopolis. You know, Joseph, the priest of with a coat of many colors. He was the high priest of Heliopolis. So the Israelites had this stone from day one. We're talking, 1500 BC or so, the era of Joseph. He was the high priest of Heliopolis. He would have had this stone in this era. Where did this stone go to? It appears to have gone to Greece, because we have the sacred Omphalos stone that appears in Delphi, the Delphi omphalos. And if you go to Delphi now, you'll see the omphalos there, but that's a sort of modern copy of the omphalos, and it's much bigger than it should be. I think it's at least twice or three times as big as it should be. And they have this stone that's covered in sort of strange celestial netting, which is made of marble or something. That is a copy of the omphalos stone, and we know that that is a reasonable copy of the omphalos because it's on all of the coinage of the Greek kings, especially the Greek kings of Persia. And so we have this imagery of the sacred omphalos, which was in Egypt, it was in Greece, it was probably in Persia, because we have all this coinage from Persia, the Greek coinage, which shows this omphalos stone. It was part of Israelite history because the two stones that went into the Ark of the Covenant were two stones. Okay, they're described as tablets, but these were the two sacred stones that went into the Ark of the Covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant and the sacred stones are part of one sacred object. The Ark simply carried the stones. And then when we come to the history of the 1st century, this Ark and the stones appear again within Syrian Judean history. So we have, which comes first? I suppose we have the Ark of the Covenant of Edessa. So the Edessan coinage shows the Ark of the Covenant being in Edessa in the 2nd century. And it was at Sogmatar, which is the Edessan necropolis. And if anyone goes out to Edessa, it's in eastern Turkey now, don't forget to go to Sogmatar because it's a wonderful place. There is a sacred hill there and some sacred tombs, and that is where the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be in the 2nd century. And this is one of the reasons why Edessa became so famous, because the Ark of the Covenant was there and it was owned by the Edessan royalty. After that time, we have the same stone, because we have images of it, so we know it's the same stone, was in Syria. So it was in Homs, which is where they're fighting now, of course. And it became the sacred stone of the royalty from Emesa, who were the royalty in charge of sort of central Syria around Homs and Damascus. And I say they are linked because these two royal families seem awfully similar. Nobody seems to know very much about the Emesan royalty, but we have the Edessan royalty and the Emesan royalty living in close proximity to each other in southern and northern Syria. And they just seem to be so similar in all respects that they have to be related, especially as they end up with this sacred stone. It ends up in Emesa. And the kings of Emesa become very famous because they achieve what the kings of Edessa never achieved. They become the emperors of Rome. So the first of the Emesan kings who becomes emperor is Septimus. I'll remember his name in a minute. He's linked to Britain as well because he created one of the walls on the borders of Septimus Severus. He created one of the walls on the borders between England and Wales. And now let's have a think about it. His great nephews also became emperors of Rome. And so the famous one of these is Emperor Elagabalus, who's not very well known as an emperor of Rome. But anyway, he was a high priest of the Elagabal sacred stone. And he was a galley high priest. So we're coming back to these galley high priests again. He was a galley. He was a eunuch. And he became emperor of Rome in the early 3rd century, about 220-ish AD. And he was not very popular in Rome because castration was actually forbidden within Rome. And Elagabalus became the emperor of Rome. And he was not only a eunuch, he was, although this might be disinformation, of course, he was accused of turning himself into a woman. So he had a penectomy as well. So he became the same as these eunuchs in India today. What do they call them? The Hajri? The eunuchs of India? Anyway, he had the same operation as those, to become a galley high priest. So we have the two together again. We have the galley high priests and the stone in 1st century biblical history, and we have the galley high priest Elagabalus and the stone within Roman history in the 3rd century AD. And we know this is a New Testament story because, as we saw, Jesus asked for his disciples to become eunuchs, and the high priest of Christianity was Simon. And his surname, his title, was the Peter. Simon Peter, or Saint Peter as he's often known. And Peter, of course, means the stone. So his name was not Peter, his name was Simon, and he was called Simon the Stone. Why? Because he looked after the sacred stone. He was the Kephas, he was the Peter. He looked after the sacred stone, and he was a eunuch. So St. Peter was a eunuch. And we even have a description of the ceremony where he became a eunuch, which was that ceremony you get on the just outside Judea, outside Jerusalem, on the Mount of Olives. If you remember, Jesus was on the Mount of Olives, and the Romans came to get Jesus, and Simon Peter cut off the ear of one of the Romans. And just after that, a young man escapes naked from this meeting on the Mount of Olives. Why was there a naked young man at this meeting where the Romans arrived? Well, he was the new galley. This was an initiation ceremony for the galley high priests. And within Arthurian history, the new galley high priest, the new eunuch, was actually Percival, who became the Galahad. And we have this wonderful description of Sir Percival thrusting his sword into his loins in order to become a eunuch. And for many, many reasons, it's pretty obvious that St. Peter was Sir Percival. And this is given to us in this is given to us in History of the Holy Grail, where, for no apparent reason, and you can imagine these authors grappling with this history. How on earth do we tell this history about St. Peter becoming a eunuch? Anyway, what they do is they give a story about Petrus, who is probably Percival, walking on water. Well, who in the gospel story walks on water? Well, it was St. Peter, of course, Simon Peter. And then they have the same story about the same character, who is Percival, and this is a difficult one because listeners probably won't know this story from the Gospels, but anyway, it is there. It is quite famous in the Gospels about the tablecloth that came down from heaven.
Right. Yeah.
You remember that one?
Yeah.
It's a very strange story that nobody understands, and I think I now understand what it is actually talking about. But Arthurian history has exactly the same. And of course, it happens in Arthurian history where this tablecloth comes down from heaven. And it's the same person. It's this St. Peter character. It's this Percival character within Arthurian history. And what it was actually saying is that this was a Masonic meeting, because Jesus was a Mason. This is what carpenter means. Jesus was not a carpenter. In the Greek, he was a tecton. And if you look it up in Greek, a tecton is a Freemason. So Jesus was a Freemason of the Judean Lodge. He was the Master Mason. In fact, higher than that, he was the supreme head of the Masonic Church in Judea. And what this tablecloth business was all about was one of the early lodge meetings. If you remember in early lodge meetings when in Britain, when they didn't have dedicated temples for the lodge meeting, what they used to have was a tablecloth. And the tablecloth would be marked out with all of the accoutrements of masonry. So that the main tablecloth would be a black and white checkerboard, the same as it is in any Masonic lodge. And you would spread this out on the ground, and then you would put the 3 tablecloths, or napkins as they call them, which were the napkins of the 3 degrees of masonry, and they would be placed upon the tablecloth. And then everyone would gather round, and you would have your Masonic meeting. And this is what St. Peter was doing with this tablecloth. It was a lodge meeting. And no doubt this tablecloth would be spread out on the floor, and it would have all sorts of astronomical, astrological imagery written on it. It was a zodiac. It was probably actually, marked out with the signs of the zodiac. Right. And this is what they were talking about. But they were talking about it within Acts of the Apostles, and they are talking about it within Arthurian history, within history of the Holy Grail. And from this, we can be pretty sure, because if we look into Merlin Grail, oh, by the way, listeners, don't read the Vulgate cycle. It will send you to sleep within the first 30 seconds. It's totally impenetrable. There's 3,500 pages of impenetrable rubbish, and you'll never get through it. So don't read the Vulgate cycle. Just get, what's it called? Merlin Grail. And it was written by Robert de Boron. And Robert de Boron, who also wrote or translated the Vulgate cycle, wrote this separate volume called Merlin Grail. And it's a complete summary of the entire Vulgate cycle in, 150 pages. It's brilliant. So he's managed to condense all of the Vulgate cycle into 150 pages. So it's a wonderful reference if you want to get a handle on some of these topics that we've been talking about.
It's one of the first, isn't it? It's one of the first times where some of the familiar motifs of the Arthurian legend appear, isn't it?
Not necessarily. Most people say that it is a summary that was done after the Vulgate cycle, in which case it's a late one. Okay. I'm not sure if it was the book that became the Vulgate cycle or whether it is a summary of. I'm not quite sure myself which way round that is.
But it's certainly the one where Joseph of Arimathea becomes a central character, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also the Holy Grail becomes a central part of it. And the Grail keepers in Merlin Grail are identified as Bronn, who is the grandfather of Sir Percival Galahad. And then the Grail jumps a generation because the son did something wrong. We'll come on to that. Anyway, he was naughty. And it jumps a generation and it goes to Sir Percival. So the 2 Grail holders were, or guardians of the Grail, were Bronn and Sir Percival. And they were the 2 eunuch Galahads as well. I'm not sure why I started this, actually. Why did I start this? I've lost my thread. Where's my thread gone?
It's very interesting, and I mean, I don't know. I got a few little notes here I've been taking as you've been talking, Ralph, that are triggering things in my mind. When you were talking about the Grail being the sacred stone, and that it was really originally guarded by a princess, which then was guarded by a knight, and the princess was symbolizing the bloodline, right? Something popped into my head, which was actually Michael had done the work on the Queen's coronation, and of course in the Queen's coronation there's the stone of scone that is there, and so you've got the princess turning into a queen that's using this stone symbolism, the sacred stone, and of course now she's residing and protecting the stone, representing it, right, in a very symbolic way. And then, speaking of sacred stones, you also have the black stone, the Kaaba stone in Mecca, and they believe in and of course we're talking about that region of the world, the East, and they have the idea that it fell from Jannah, which would be like the garden, or from heaven, right? And it was supposed to show Adam and Eve where to build an altar, and again it became the first temple on earth. So you've got these sacred stone motifs throughout these religions, and then also symbolized in royal coronations and whatnot, and it just so interesting that it all falls into place through the Arthurian legend, as you're saying.
And in the coronation, she's given 2 rings, sapphire and ruby, colors that Ralph has explained in previous books going back to Egypt and the cult of Set, remember?
Yeah, yep.
And Georges, the Saint George. I mean, we're not going to get into that, but the stone that a king would wear on his finger is a metaphor or euphemism, just like the lingam stone or stone of Phal, as you're saying, David. The mound, I would say even the Mount of Olives or the Sermon on the Mount, all of these conical type things. We dealt with this in the female Illuminati actually extensively, that conical shape.
Right.
Leonardo da Vinci has a painting of a small altar where Mary, apparently the Virgin Mary, is overlooking there's an angel on one side, I think, Mary on the other, and in the middle there's a conical stone. So this thing is definitely a protectorate of the goddess. But even the stones that one would wear as a king on their finger probably relate as a euphemism to this stone that you're talking about, the conical stone on your finger of kingship and connection to the heavens.
And where they were placed as well, because all of these stones were actually situated upon conical hills. I think myself the original conical hill was the Great Pyramid, but within Judean type history, this stone was located at Tekoa, which is Herodium, which is the conical hill south of Jerusalem. If anyone's been there, it's quite a wonderful place. Herod built a castle on the top of it, but you've got this strangely shaped conical hill south of Jerusalem. In Edessa, it was put on the hill at Sogmatar, and that was a conical hill exactly the same. In Emesa, they have another conical hill, which happens to be a volcano with a castle on the top of it, which is just outside Homs. I've got a picture of that in the book as well. And where do we get? Oh, we've got another one, of course, at Silbury, which is the strangely enough, the hill at Sogmatar in Syria is exactly the same dimensions and shape as the hill at Silbury. But there we go. That's another strange coincidence.
Just look how important these hills and mounds were in Celtic mythology. I mean, they've sort of been considered goddess symbols as well, but they're not just in the West. They're all over the place, as you say. But this is a tremendous way to decode that symbol, which turns up, I mean, in so many places. It's not even funny. Right from the, Mount Sinai symbolism or Mount Horeb. I mean, it's up Mount Ararat. I mean, just think of the symbols of the mount that through the mythologies of the world.
And then Arthur himself having to pull Excalibur out of the stone, right? Or the Lady of the Lake, right? Or then it was the sword and the stone. I'm trying to remember how the order went.
Yeah,
that element was there as well.
Strangely enough, Excalibur doesn't take a very big part of Arthurian history.
It's
added. Not mentioned. Yeah, it's not mentioned very often at all. So it's really not a part of my book because it's not really a central component. They have this wonderful, strange addition to it where the sword is actually stuck in a princess instead. instead of a stone. So the princess and the stone are being linked again because the sword gets stuck in a princess as well as being stuck in a stone.
Well, and as previously mentioned, the sword was decapitating the man's stones to make them the eunuchs, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it was doing that as well. And the Grail.
I was going to say it connects to this act of castration, which is at once a symbol of self-mastery, but self-initiating yourself to a higher level of the order, shall we say, right, or the rites, and that's coming from the gynocratic period, but it's the man linking himself as an agent. And then you see, remember we were looking at earlier the idea of whether it was a dragon or a fish. In one way, the Pendragon can still be a dragon, though, after what you're saying, if one accepts that that the Grail is really a bloodline. Symbolized by the object. The object is, in the end of the day, not really that important. It's just a metaphor for the actual bloodline. Then, in one way, dragon does work because it's the bloodline. It's the dragon court. In fact, even one of the original etymologies, they thought it may be actually wrong, but the Grail itself, that word comes from either kratis, which meant a woven basket, or gradus, which we get our word grades. The grades of or degrees or stages of. So again, you're perfectly right. If the etymology of Grail comes from gradus, then it is about the gradual unfolding of something, the gradual stages, steps along the way, which can mean either Masonic type degrees, some other kind of astrological series of rites, or you often see in medieval art, Mary is on steps leading up to the temple. She's often seen standing on the 5th or 7th step. You'll see these steps, so there's definitely the female in regard, some sort of unfolding, and the Grail etymology possibly also ties into that.
Yeah, except I would have to differ with you on one point there, in that Arthurian history is quite certain that the stone came first and the bloodline came second. So the important aspect was the delivery of the stone from aliens, as it says, to the bloodline. So the stone is the most important aspect of this. And the stone was given to the bloodline to look after. So the bloodline came second, the stone came first. So the most sacred item, is the stone. And the Grail Keeper has to be a eunuch, presumably because of the people who gave the stone were eunuchs. I can't trace it any further back than Egyptian history, because we don't know who gave the stone in the first place. But this castrated eunuch business, to me, appears to come from Akhenaten. So we're going back into Egyptian history and Pharaoh Akhenaten again, because the Galileans worshipped the primeval Adam, was their prime god, was the primeval Adam. And the primeval Adam is an Atum type character, the god Atum from Egypt, who was, a solitary god, who was not exactly a eunuch, but he was certainly a sort of, not a hermaphrodite. Anyway, he had to embody the male and the female because he was just one god on his own. And what happened in some respects is that Pharaoh Akhenaten tried to imitate and model himself upon the Atum type character, the primeval Adam. And so if you look at any of the statuary and sculptures of Akhenaten, he is always portrayed as a eunuch. Well, no, not even a eunuch. He is a what's the word I'm looking for?
Like a hermaphrodite.
Not a hermaphrodite, because they have both sexual organs, but something that is not asexual completely, has no sexual organs at all. Anyway, he's portrayed in that fashion. So just like Emperor Elagabalus tried to neuter himself completely, and the Galli high priests tried to neuter themselves completely. So Akhenaten did exactly the same. And of course, in one of my early books, Eden in Egypt, I identify the biblical Adam with Akhenaten. So Adam and Eve were actually Akhenaten and Nefertiti.
I think that book is also monumental. I've read that book. It was one of my favorites. It's absolutely extrapolates some of the more difficult, aspects of the Akhenaten reign are completely made transparent in that book. So it's really fantastic. And it's also tied deeply into the Old Testament Genesis story.
Yeah, it sort of makes sense of the Old Testament story, which never made sense before whatsoever, and suddenly it starts to make sense. But it also brings Akhenaten in as a central component at the foundation of Israelite Judean history, as being the archetypal Adam, the primeval Adam, the first man, the proanthropos, as they call it, the first man. And so he was the original eunuch. And so if you're having a priesthood that maintain this tradition, the Galli priesthood, they would have to imitate Pharaoh Akhenaten. And if they're going to imitate Akhenaten, they're going to have to be, at the very least, castrated. And this, I think, is one of the original foundations where this particular tradition came from. And so it came out of Egypt.
Sorry to interject again, but at Chartres Cathedral, the Grail is seen in the hands of the famous effigy of Melchizedek.
Oh, yes, the high priest.
Yeah, so on the statuary, and we know that Chartres was not only a goddess center, but it was Masonically built. How come they're showing Melchizedek? And in my work, Melchizedek is Akhenaten. It's just a euphemism, like Moses was, what you had brought to the fore. Moses and Akhenaten are identified. If not exactly the same person, then certainly very closely identified. And in my work, Melchizedek is the Masonic rendition of Akhenaten. And there you have it in Chartres Cathedral. He's actually holding the Grail.
That could well be, actually. I've never thought of it in that fashion. That could well be, actually. That would fit very well, because Jesus was supposed to be the follower from Melchizedek.
Yeah, and remember at the Queen's coronation, it's Handel's Zadok, which is the priests of Zadok are the Galli. From the ancient times, the priests of Zadok would probably fit that. I mean, we have to look into it, but it's the same cult as far as I'm concerned, an Egyptoid cult. And curiously, in the coronation of the Queen, it's Handel's Zadok King that's being sung. So it's just incredible how this happened.
Because the brother of Jesus was James, and James was the Zadok.
Right.
James is called, James is called James the Just. And this is the trouble when you get so many languages all together. This is why it's very difficult to follow these names. But Justus, in the English, if you translate it into Aramaic, is Zadok.
Oh,
so
wow.
he was called James Zadok. That was his official title. So he was a Zadok. So yes, we come back to the same story that.
But then they're the Grail. That family, then, as you're saying, that's confirmation. Right there in Chartres Cathedral in stone.
Yes,
it's the Melchizedek characters holding the Grail.
Yeah, and Jesus would have been the new Grail holder. He would have been which is why he was called the Galilean, because the Galileans were the Grail holders. They were the Galli high priests. The eunuchs of the Galli priesthood.
Wow.
So it all begins to tie in.